The First World War is usually understood as the titanic clash of empires, but we propose that it can equally be understood as a watershed movement in the history of cultural encounters. Between 1914 and 1918, hundreds of thousands of Asians, Africans, Pacific Islanders, they're all journeying to the heart of whiteness, Europe and beyond, Mesopotamia, East Africa, Gallipoli, Persia, to take part in the war. And in the process, there's this extraordinary range of encounters taking place. Our project, Cultural Exchange in the Time of Global Conflict, Colonials, Neutrals and Belligerents during the First World War, is a 3-year collaborative research project funded by the Humanities in European Research Area. I'm the project leader, and there are 3 other principal investigators, and we'll be looking at libraries, archives and even attics from Bombay to Belgium to Berlin in order to ask and try to answer one single question. How did the First World War create new spaces for and put pressures on encounters between people and cultures from colonized, neutral and belligerent countries? What traces did it leave in the visual and cultural consciousness of the time? More than 4 million non-white people were recruited into the armies of Europe and America, and a chunk of them came to Europe. For example, more than 1 million Indians traveled to different theaters of war, and around 140,000 of them came to Western Front, and they stayed here from 1914. But it's a very intense period, because for one hand, they faced some of the most intense bombardment in the opening months. On the other hand, beyond the front, this whole new world of cultural encounter and contact was opening up for these people, in which adventure, thrill, trepidation, anxiety, prejudice, they were all fused and confused.
Non-European troops have been obliterated from the history of the First World War due to many reasons, until quite recently. And if I would say it in a positive sense, we'll finally have rediscovered them, though they still haven't the place they ought to have in the commemoration.
This piece of history has really been hidden for a variety of reasons. People weren't encouraged to write about it at the time. Many of the people involved didn't have the literacy skills to do that, but there were also many decades when it was simply neglected. I think we forget how recently it is that we as a society have become interested in those stories of the people who were further down the military hierarchy. And of course nowadays everybody is interested in everyone's experience and how wonderful that is.
And it shows a French lady and a Maori soldier. They are meeting each other, but there's this kind of odd space between them. And in fact, that is almost emblematic of the awkwardness sometimes of the encounter. We are very used to images of soldiers in the trenches, but often what happens behind or beyond is equally, if not more, interesting. I love this photograph. It is an Indian cook grinding pepper in a Turkish shell which was fired into their camp while it was stationed in Egypt. So we have a Turkish shell manufactured to wound and to kill, and here completely domesticated. And it's just different kinds of stories that these objects tell, and there's different kind of encounters that soldiers are having, not just with other men, but also with objects. One of the most thrilling aspects of this collaborative international research project is that we have within our group something like 14 languages and from very different disciplinary backgrounds. And what it means is that it gives us access to a very wide range of sources across countries, archives, and different forms, from trench artifacts to photographs, literary texts, paintings, sketches, to those extraordinary sound recordings that have recently been unearthed in the Humboldt archive in Berlin. And some of the questions that we ask are, how are these sources themselves involved in the processes of cultural encounter? For example, how do the different sources, how do they interact with each other? Because one of the things we try to do methodologically is to put, for example, a photograph next to a passage from a literary text which is describing the same scene. For example, there's a very tender moment in the novel Across the Black Waters by Mulk Rajanand, where he describes an Indian sepoy interacting with a Belgian boy. And then we have a picture from the EAP archive. So how do these two sources speak to each other and help a fuller understanding of what is going on? We have seen a lot of posters of Empire Needs You, whereas here there's a very different sort of poster which was published for recruitment in India. And it's very interesting, we don't have any human being. It's a question mark in the place of the face and an uniform. And then we have a rifle and then a hand full of coins. And this poster, I think, sums up these three main attractions often for the Indian sepoy. So it's interesting that we don't really have anything about imperial loyalty, but these three things. It's very important to see these posters alongside the songs and verses that were practiced to recruit men, because these are non-literate people we are talking about. Here you get old shoes, there you will get full boots, get enlisted. Here you get torn rags, there you will get suits, get enlisted. Here you get dry bread, there you will get biscuits. Here you have to struggle, there you will get salutes, get enlisted. This is what was no man's land, and that was the jump-off point for Indians during the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, where the Indians for the first time faced gas attack and they are very badly gassed. And 100 years later, we have this cemetery beautifully maintained, and yet there is this strange gap. So here we have all the white graves, and then we have a few non-white graves. And in the middle of it, we have one Indian grave. It says the unknown sepoy killed, and that was during the Second Battle of Ypres. In a way, Ypres is the site of trauma. This is where the war was taking place. This is also where many of the cultural encounters would be taking place. For example, as the extraordinary diaries of Father Van Velligen tells us, when he notes when the Indian soldiers arrive or the Caribbean troops arrive. So Ypres is absolutely central. It's the cockpit, in a way, of cultural encounters. And what is extraordinary is that when we look at Ypres today, we almost forget that every building of the city was destroyed, and it has been painstakingly and lovingly rebuilt. So what we are looking at all around us, every block has been rebuilt, and it's almost like a defiant assertion of the city after the First World War. My God, here, and this is from...
This is British. It's some kind of art book.
Yes, verses by
verses. Yes, but they are so stereotypical. I mean, you will see fighting types, and then of course the Indian is in there.
Oh my God, the whole martial race myth, like the
turban and the knife.
At that time, the soldiers were recruited according to the martial race theory, because it was deemed that only some kinds of Indians were fit to be soldiers, and it's a very, very narrow fragment of the Indian society from which the soldiers were recruited.
These are actually cartoons that were published in the most famous German trench newspaper that was published for all the troops in Flanders and northern France, the Liller Kriegszeitung, was published in Lille.
Oh my God, this is absolutely nasty.
It is a nasty one. It's quite well known as well. So you actually see a stereotypical African village with a mother
and the two
kids completely naked. Papa has gone to Europe to protect the good English for the barbarians, and if you are kind, he will bring you a German beefsteak.
One of the most challenging things we faced is that what are our sources? Because we are talking about a largely non-literate group of people the moment we step outside Europe into these colonial troops. For example, Punjab contributed more than half the number of Indian combatants, but the literacy rate was only 5%. And here there is this very poignant picture. This is an Indian giving a thumb impression on a bit of paper in order to collect his pay. And we realize that it is non-literate. And then there is this other picture from the Brighton Pavilion, where this Indian is dictating a letter to a scribe, and the scribe is writing the letter. So in order to recover this whole colonial experience, we have to move beyond conventional archives and methodologies and look at objects, look at photographs, look at artifacts and oral memory.
एक आदमी थी फिर मांस खाता मक्खन खाता थी हिंदुस्तान में दो सेर दूध पीता थी एक आदमी.
This is one of the over 2,000 sound recordings that were done in the prisoner of war camp in Wunsdorf and Zossen during 1915 and 1918 by the Royal Prussian Phonographic Commission. For example, here we can see that how the soldiers were made to stand in front of a phonograph and are asked to read a text or sing a song or tell a story. And this is one of the most moving things I've heard. This is a Sepoy saying that how he misses the butter he used to have in India. And it's interesting that he's remembering his homeland through the food that he used to eat, and that he used to have 2 sairs of milk, and that he pines to go back to India. This is an extraordinary colonial laboratory and space of cultural encounter, because here are these colonial prisoners, including a lot of South Asian prisoners. They are being photographed, their bodies are being measured, their voices are being recorded, and even a short film was made about them. And this prisoner of war camp puts pressure on the whole concept of cultural encounter. Was it mutual? Did it involve exchange? What was the nature of relationship between these German ethnologists and musicologists and these prisoners of war?
It has been a hospital throughout the war, so mainly British casualties, but at a certain period it served as an Indian hospital.
And the cemetery is also quite close by. So,
hoe ver is not Kharkov? Tot Engels Kharkov.
Hier,
so the people,
300 meters.
It's only 300 yards.
just 300 yards.
300 yards, and again, that's the normal thing to do. You have the hospital, and then at a safe distance, but very nearby, you will find a cemetery.
This is the second battlefield where the ultimate battle goes on between life and death. But even there, at that space, there's this, again, new encounters taking place between these doctors and these patients. And the doctors would often be touching the soldiers in order to understand that who would be sent back and who would die. So this is the place where these bodies, these Indian Sepoys, would have lain on stretchers in terrible states of injury. Even after working on this for a decade, every time I come here, the rawness and the enormity of the conflict, this row upon row upon row of these gravestones, and each for not just one individual, but entire families, that hits me afresh. This is one of the most kind of moving places I have come to, because this is where some people still had a chance of life, of being then going back to India possibly, and this is where some very, very tough choices were made between who are going to live and who would be left here forever, to be shipped there across to the cemetery. Well, it hits you in the guts, I guess, because this would be a place full of bodies not yet dead, and that makes the difference, not yet dead. But we are trying our best to balance the academic and this public outreach, because this is a project in which a lot of community members are actively, passionately interested, and it is our duty to make this material available to them. A whole range of encounters is taking place, but at the same time, even amidst the Allied soldiers, it's not always holding hands across the seas, but the overall imperial and often racist structures, they were very much in place. For example, the Indian soldier or officer was always inferior to the British officer. In times of war, encounters can stress difference, it can fan prejudice, it can fuel racism, but also tensions between the various colonial groups that have assembled. You know, this friction between different communities, they are painful histories, they are unattractive histories, but it's absolutely essential that we confront them and try to understand them, particularly during the centennial years of the war's commemoration.